You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. This week I'm talking about outsourcing with Sophie Swanborough. Sophie is the Operations and Marketing Manager at ntitle, which is an outsourced title investigation service, isn't it, Sophie?
Yes, yeah. So we specialise in outsourcing title investigations, searches, management packs and things like that, and we bring together and collate the reports for the conveyancer.
Outsourcing is a increasingly important part of conveyancing. We've just been chatting before we started about how perhaps the role of the conveyancer might change and develop over the course of the next few years. Let me, in the first instance, though, ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background? What's your role at ntitle?
Yeah, so I started out at another firm where we met many years ago, David, at Lawyer Checker. I gained some experience about the industry at the time, and I was studying my LPC and Masters, particularly focused on conveyancing at the time. So I think it was really important to gain more knowledge about the area, know about the industry a little bit more and the emerging technologies. And it's from there that Lawyer Checker used to resell ntitle, and that's how I met the two Nicholas and became involved with them. So after a few years, I got a job offer with them, and I couldn't say no. I loved working with them and loved knowing about what they do and being able to spread that message a bit more.
What does the day-to-day look like for you?
So for me, I do lots of different aspects within the business. So I look at anything from the day-to-day operations, marketing to product development. I speak to a lot of clients, so I hear things, about what the industry is doing, what they're looking for from their title investigation and outsource services. And it's great because you get to speak to lots of different people. You get to have their take on it, and it really does help for us to see what services are in demand and to help us grow, really.
I know through COVID, outsourcing became increasingly popular, and I know that ntitle in particular were a beneficiary of that growth. Talk to us a little bit about your experience of how outsourcing is different from hiring in somebody into the organisation.
I think the way that the industry is moving is that outsourcing is becoming even more popular. It's becoming something that maybe wasn't considered pre-pandemic, and I think that's where the pandemic has really moved the industry along much quicker in terms of changing, embracing different technologies. It's really interesting to see that movement. But when it comes to advertising for a job, looking for recruitment, really difficult at the moment, as we know, to get an experienced conveyancer on board. It costs the firm a lot of time, a lot of money. You're having to train people, advertising the job, potentially using recruitment agencies. When you can use a service, an outsourced service, they are essentially being able to reduce that process. You don't need somebody who is as experienced when you have multiple outsourced specialised services. And I think that's a really important thing. And outsourced services will typically only really specialise in one area. So they become subject matter experts. And that essentially means that you can use these multiple services to reduce the transaction timeline, first of all, but also take that shortage of an experienced conveyancer and fill it with other people's experience. And, when it comes to using that, it'll help you maintain business timelines, business operations, and also the consumer, your buyer, will ultimately feel the benefit of that.
You just mentioned there about the fact that there are extending timelines on the transaction. I think the last stats that we published in Today's Conveyancer was knocking on for 24 weeks, something like that. How does outsourcing help with that challenge? Because the narrative at the moment is that technology isn't really helping transaction timelines.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to transaction timelines, it's really important for firms to see that as that's a selling point for your firm. Ultimately, we talk about, and I heard it mentioned before, Amazon Prime Conveyancing. They talk about the speed and the cost and having quick transactions and low costs. And ultimately, it is a competitive market, and people want to know that they're going to get more for their money as such, and with the transaction timeline, that's a really important feature, because time, as they say, is money. So you want to be able to pay for a service that is going to be market leading in terms of pace. We've had for ourselves people report timelines being reduced by up to 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending on the technology that they're using, other than ntitle, obviously, when it comes to that. But if you think about a process that the person starts on, for example, Rightmove or Zoopla, they then move on to picking their solicitor, the conveyancer, on Google, probably. They don't go to their local high street firm anymore as often as they used to. Most people who are, millennials will Google, they'll look at the reviews, they will look at the timescales and the promise of service, and they'll make a decision based off that kind of information, mostly online. It's not as likely that people will go to a firm directly without having, done a little bit of research now. So I think when it comes to timescales, the fact that you can pick a house online, find a house online, you can find a conveyancer online, and if that conveyancer uses the right technology, they can do electronic ID and source of funds without the person even leaving their home. They can send over contracts to get everything started via apps or email, kind of e-signature technology. And when it comes to that, you can then use, certain service providers will get things back a little bit quicker. Using those, you then pass the transaction off to ntitle. That's then back with a title investigation, report on title, searches, management pack, all those things can be checked. We get that back within 2 working days. So utilising lots of these different technologies along that process, you can really speed up transactions. And I think that the more firms embrace that idea, the more benefits the buyer is going to have. And that ultimately is what you're doing the process for. You're doing it for the consumer, and the consumer wants speed, wants expertise, wants a lot. We're seeing that more often at the moment. You have to be an expert in everything, and it's just not sustainable.
We were chatting before we started the podcast around the fact that a number of these tasks can be done concurrently. So rather than this, then that, then the other, then the next thing, actually what we can do is we can do a number of these things at the same time, so as to save time in the transaction. I know you guys use a fair amount of automation in what you do, and of course one of the big issues that we have with technology and automation and dare I say artificial intelligence is that there's this idea that it's somehow going to replace conveyancers. And as you say, the conveyancer's role is to check the title, surely. So why are we outsourcing this? What's your view on that idea, that risk, I suppose, that in some way we're dumbing down the role of a conveyancer, or we're replacing conveyancers in some way?
Yeah, and that's a point that I think comes across, and you hear it quite a lot. Conveyancing is a specialist skill. It is something that a lot of people have spent many years, decades learning. And ultimately, when it comes to conveyancing, we come across things all the time that we've never heard of, really random parts in a transaction. And that's usually, obviously, for us within the title investigation. But I think that nobody can ever know everything. And what technology can't do is replace a human. It can't replace the knowledge, the broad knowledge and experience of somebody, and common sense of a person. It can't replace those things. But ultimately, to utilize all these different technologies, you still need human intervention. And that human intervention is what collates the information and then they have to understand it, interpret it, and apply the use. So it's really important. Yeah, it doesn't replace the conveyancer, it doesn't replace their skills and their knowledge, but it does help to speed up transactions. When you've got the right technologies in place and you're utilising the right services, it can really make a difference to the whole transaction. But it cannot replace the person. The person needs to be there to do every part of that and pull it all together. And for example, as you mentioned with ntitle, we have a lot of automation with our services to make things quicker, so we can collate reports quicker, for example. But ultimately, there's still an experienced team member who is manually looking through every single document, every single page, exactly like somebody would in a firm, but we're using tech and a specialized service to reduce that timescale to the 2 working day turnaround. So essentially, what you might have is a title investigation sat on your desk for a few days because you've got client calls, you've got new clients, emails, you've got contracts to send out, you've got ID to do for another new client that's come on board. You're trying to do almost too much, and there has to be a breaking point where they understand that technology needs to be embraced to really keep moving things forwards, because they say about the caseloads. I saw a recent article that you put up about caseloads having increased. That's a burden that cannot be sustained, and ultimately people embracing the right technology and being able to do that can make a big difference. But yeah, absolutely, it cannot replace a person. A person needs to be at the centre of all this to understand and interpret everything.
You mentioned that you use automation to pull your reports together, for example. What does automation look like for ntitle?
So for us, it's how we collate our reports. We have, I hesitate to use the word templates. Template's probably not the right thing because it's so specialised. It's so specific with inquiries. We have essentially a base that our title investigators will use for each of their transactions that they do, and there's some wording that just won't change throughout a transaction, throughout a title investigation, so we're able to keep that. For example, the report on title, lots of that information is the same for every buyer, so we keep some aspects of that. But for our title investigators, we have maybe specific phrases and specific information that we would use. That inquiries come up, okay, well, this is the wording that we'd use for that. So a lot of it is stuff that is just meant for the speed of the transaction, being able to go through this whole process and be able to report on that title, within the 2 working days. And essentially that is the crux of what we do and how we do it. We also use our cloud platforms, which essentially mean that you can submit a title investigation to us in less than 3 minutes. That is a really key feature for the person using our service, because if you get your report back within 2 days, you get an email to say it's done from our hub. You log into the secure hub, and then you've got access to your title investigation within those 2 days. Often less than 2 days, you get it back. Some people get it back within 1 day. And I think that's a really important feature, is that when it comes to using these technologies and using outsourced services, it's designed to save time. You don't want to be doing something like, for example, submitting a title instruction to ourselves and having it take 20 minutes, because you could have already started the process in that time, especially with a freehold. So when it comes to that, we make it quick, we make it easy. And if you can submit a title investigation within three minutes and get it back 2 days later, and you're doing that with all your title investigations, you could spend an hour submitting lots of different title investigations to us, get it all back within 2 days. Imagine the speed of the transactions you're going to have then after that. And that's essentially how we do it. We brace different technologies to make that quicker.
You've touched on the fact that obviously reviewing a freehold versus a leasehold is going to be a different sort of time scale. Is that typically what you see when work is submitted to you? Do you, for example, find that firms are using you for a particular type of work, perhaps for a slightly more complicated transaction, or do you see that they're using you across the board?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's interesting to see how firms will use us throughout the year. Some firms will use us on every transaction. So they've seen the benefits of using a specialist service, and they will use for every transaction they do, they use ntitle, and that's to include the extras like searches and management packs, etc. So they can just put it all together. They've got it all from the seller solicitors, put it all onto our system, and then they can leave it for a couple of days and knowing it's done. But we do see firms who will maybe only use us for particular matters where there's a lack of expertise in a particular area, and new builds is a really common one for that. We see a lot of people who will submit a new build because, one, they are really lengthy. You get many documents with them. Two, they take up quite a lot of time to do. If you can spend, potentially 3 hours doing your new build transaction, and you do that without getting interrupted, without having other people contacting you, without other things going on in the transactions that you're doing, many transactions at the same time, then that's pretty lucky, I would say. Most people don't have that block of potentially up to 3 hours to do that. So I think we see a lot of that because of the time, because of the expertise. Leaseholds at the moment, we can see that in the news and on the LinkedIn feed. You see that all the time, that leaseholds are becoming quite problematic. And I think I have seen a post where somebody had said it could be a specialised service in the future, specialist service. So I do think that we are used in many different ways, because ultimately, as we say to the firms who do use us, we're here for you to use as and when you need. But yeah, particularly with new builds, we are seeing that it's a lack of expertise. It could be that a experienced conveyancer's left, or they're a fairly new company and they're just not 100% confident on being able to tackle those transactions without a little bit of our knowledge, really. And it says a lot that people can progress these transactions by using ntitle that they wouldn't have been able to had they not heard of our service and used our service.
I think two things come to mind really with your particular business. I mean, one, you've identified the fact that obviously it's quite difficult to recruit conveyancers at the moment. You are in effect recruiting for a very specialized skill set. Is that not a challenge for you as well?
When it comes to growth, you have to have the right people in at the right place, and we have quite a stringent process for hiring new people ourselves and bringing new people in. And I think that really comes down to the experience of each conveyancer that you have through. So they'll do different test matters to see how they produce their work, because one thing that we do know about title investigation is it's a very personal thing, that somebody would raise something that somebody else wouldn't, and we see that quite often when we're speaking to firms and we're doing kind of maybe an account review, and you get one person saying, oh, I'd include that, and another person saying, oh, I don't think I would, and you have these different conversations with them, but it's it is really quite a personal thing. So when we bring somebody on board for ourselves, it's especially for Nicola and Nicola, this is their business, this is their specialist area, and they are so passionate about what they do. It's important that everybody who comes on board is equally passionate, and obviously we have our minimum requirements, so they must be experienced 5 years post-qualified. So there are minimum requirements, but it also has to be the right person for the job, the person who has to be able to spot any particular issues on the title investigation, just as a basis, be able to pick up on any issues, but also somebody who has like a thirst for knowledge and wants to grow and get better and better at different areas as these emerging rules and regulations come in. We've had to keep up to date with everything that's been coming in, and our team are brilliant at doing that. They'll see a post or they'll see an update somewhere, and then we'll share that within the group and have any relevant training notes go out to make sure that we're all kept up to date with everything, because the market changes quickly, regulations change quickly. I'll say quickly. It changes, but when it does, it's usually something that really does affect the transaction, and we've seen that with the new build regulations.
So put your money where your mouth is. We've talked about the fact that there's different features and benefits to outsourcing versus hiring, but ultimately this comes down to cost, surely. If it's more cost effective for a firm to hire somebody, they will, and if it's more cost effective to outsource, they'll do that.
The cost of recruiting, it's not just recruitment. You've got potentially recruitment firms, which do take quite a chunk. If that's a conveyancer, you're talking, I think it's between 20 and 30% the last time I looked, something like that. That's a lot of money. You're parting with just to get somebody in. You've then got to provide the fixed cost of an employee, which includes things like pension. You've got to train them on the systems you use. You've got the equipment, paying for software. That's a really lengthy and expensive process to bring somebody on board. So it's all, it's one thing to get somebody with the right knowledge and experience, but actually bringing somebody on board, that process of having somebody being trained on everything and the fixed cost of an employee is quite a large expense for a firm. It's probably the biggest expense for a firm. And that's all stuff in addition to the actual recruitment process, which can be lengthy in itself. I think it's really important that firms are aware that there's a different way to work. There's a different way for firms to have everything in terms of expertise, speed and knowledge just from using an outsourced service as opposed to hiring somebody with that. And we see that quite often at the moment, that the consultancy model is one that firms are moving towards, because ultimately it's cheaper. You don't have to pay. You take a percentage of what they do, and it works out best for everybody. So I think we're seeing that more and more for that particular reason. I don't think people want the fixed cost. It is a liability in terms of firms' expense.
We're fast running out of time, Sophie, but I'm intrigued by this discussion that you've just had about the consultant solicitor and the profile of firm that is using outsourcing, is using services like yourself, because my suspicion is that you're currently dealing with quite tech-enabled, forward-thinking firms. Tell me about the profile of organisations that are using ntitle or using outsourced services.
Yeah, that's the real beauty of outsourced services, is that you just don't know what firms it might appeal to and for what reasons. And I think that is ultimately the biggest part of our services, is firms will use us for so many different reasons. There's not just one reason why a firm will come to us, it's many. And we do see firms of all shapes and sizes. We have some firms who may have just a couple of people in their conveyancing department. They're looking to grow, or they don't have as much time per transaction because there's only two of them. You see it from holiday leave. We see a lot of people coming through for somebody who's gone on maternity, or a conveyance just left, an experienced conveyance just left, and they need to fill those gaps. We see lots of different firms and lots of different size firms. So we have some firms that are, do massive number of transactions, and they'll use us for particularly difficult ones, or they might not use us for freeholds, but just leaseholds and new builds. And we'll see that happen quite a lot. But yeah, we have quite a number of high street firms. Actually, typically they're the ones to embrace the process a little bit more, because they can see the way that the industry is moving. They can see that they need to have something, an edge, to keep up, because ultimately we are filling up. And I know the term conveyancing factory is used quite a lot with a number of different firms. We don't want to become necessarily a conveyancing factory, but ultimately that is where people are moving towards, being able to get transactions moving quicker. But having that personal touch of a high street firm that use technology and embrace the different outsourced services that are available, that makes a huge difference in their transaction. And then ultimately we can see on the reviews that come up on LinkedIn that the person's really happy with the service, and we know that we've been part of that process. So for us, it's really important. And for those firms in particular, we tend to speak to them a little bit more. We have a closer relationship with them, probably like they would with their client. They are personable people. A small high street firm might not do loads of transactions every month, but they're the people they're ultimately looking to keep up with the market. So yeah, we see a lot of high street firms.
I think you might have surprised me a little bit there in terms of the profile of the firm that's using you, but in a really positive way, because it's nice to hear that the profession is responding to the challenge that's been set them in terms of how do we increase volume, how do we increase efficiency, how do we increase transaction speed. We're out of time, Sophie. It's been really, really interesting to talk to you, not just about ntitle, but actually about outsourcing in general, and you share your thoughts on that. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, David.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Sophie. Thank you for listening as ever, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.